the poison of comparison. There is an emotion so corrosive, so fundamentally destabilizing to the human soul that we hide it even from ourselves. We will admit to anger, to sadness, even to hatred. But envy we bury deep, concealing it beneath layers of rationalization, disguising it as righteous indignation, transforming it into criticism of those we secretly wish to be. Envy is the emotion we are most ashamed to feel because it reveals a truth we cannot bear to acknowledge. We believe ourselves inferior, insufficient, less than. Shakespeare called it the green-eyed monster, and the image is apt. Envy is monstrous, not because it is alien to human nature, but because it is so deeply, so painfully human. It gnaws at us from within, poisoning our capacity for joy, our ability to celebrate others, our sense of our own worth. What others have becomes evidence of what we lack. Their success becomes our failure. Their happiness becomes our misery. The philosopher Kierkegaard understood that envy is despair in disguise, a refusal to be oneself manifesting as resentment toward those who appear to be successfully themselves. We do not envy randomly. We envy those who possess what we secretly believe we should have, what we think would make us whole, what we imagine would finally prove our worth. But envy is more than simple wanting. It is wanting poisoned by the belief that another's possession of something diminishes us, that their gain is somehow our loss, that in the zero-sum game of worth and value, their rise necessitates our fall. This is the terrible logic of envy. It transforms abundance into scarcity, connection into competition, shared humanity into a battlefield of comparison, where there are only winners and losers, and we are always losing. The psychology of envy is the psychology of the wounded self, desperately seeking proof of its value in a world that seems to grant that proof to everyone but us. The nature of envy, psychological foundations. To understand envy, we must first distinguish it from jealousy, though the two are often confused. Jealousy involves three parties. It is the fear of losing something you have to another person. You are jealous when you fear your partner might leave you for someone else, when you worry that your position might be taken by a rival. Jealousy says, what is mine might be stolen. But envy involves only two parties and is more poisonous. Envy is the pain of witnessing another person possess something you desire but do not have. It is not fear of loss, but anguish at another's gain. Envy says, they have what I should have, and their having it is an injustice, an offense against the natural order, a wound to my very being. The German word for envy is Neid, which shares roots with the word for hatred. This linguistic connection reveals something profound. Envy is not simply desire. It is desire mixed with hostility, with resentment, with the secret wish that the other person would lose what they have. If I cannot have it, neither should they. This is envy's dark heart, the aspect of it we are most ashamed to acknowledge. Aristotle understood envy as pain at the good fortune of equals. We do not envy distant others, those so far above or below us that comparison is meaningless. We envy those close to us in status, in circumstances, in identity. The academic envies other academics, not movie stars. The athlete envies other athletes, not philosophers. We envy those who represent what we might have been, who achieved what we believe we deserved, who possess what we think should have been ours. This proximity is crucial to understanding envy's intensity. The success of someone very different from us can be celebrated or ignored, but the success of someone similar, someone who started where we started, someone whose advantages were no greater than ours, this success is unbearable. It removes the excuses we have constructed. If they could succeed with no more than I had, then my failure is truly mine. Their success becomes evidence of my inadequacy. Psychologically, envy serves as a defense against shame. When we feel fundamentally inadequate, fundamentally less than, this feeling is unbearable. Envy allows us to externalize the problem. The issue is not that I am deficient. The issue is that the world is unfair, that others have what they do not deserve, that success is distributed unjustly. Envy transforms the internal wound of shame into external grievance against others. But this defense is costly. It requires us to constantly monitor what others have, to measure ourselves against them, to maintain vigilance over the distribution of goods and achievements and recognition. The envious person cannot rest. Every social media post, every conversation about accomplishments, every sign of another's happiness or success becomes a potential trigger, a reminder of their own lack. Melanie Klein, the psychoanalyst, traced envy to the earliest stages of infant development. The infant envies the breast, she argued, envies its goodness, its capacity to provide nourishment and comfort. This primitive envy contains the seed of all later envy, the rage at being dependent on something outside ourselves for what we need, the resentment toward the source of goodness, precisely because we need it and cannot generate it ourselves. This may sound abstract, but it points to something essential. Envy is fundamentally about dependency and powerlessness. We envy what we feel we cannot create for ourselves, what we must receive from others or from fortune, what is beyond our control. The person who feels capable of creating their own success is less vulnerable to envy than the person who feels their worth depends on external validation, on luck, on being chosen or recognized by others. Envy also reveals our values, often values we have not consciously chosen but have absorbed from our culture, our family, our social world. We envy what we have been taught to value. In a culture that values wealth, we envy the wealthy. In a culture that values beauty, we envy the beautiful. In a culture that values achievement, we envy the accomplished. Envy is a map of our internalized value system, showing us what we believe we need in order to matter. But there is a paradox here. Often what we envy is not what we genuinely want, but what we believe we should want, what we think would make us acceptable to others, what we imagine would finally prove our worth. We envy the person with the prestigious career while secretly longing for creative freedom. We envy the person with the perfect family while secretly craving solitude. We envy the admired life while wanting a hidden one. This disconnect between what we envy and what we truly desire creates a double suffering. We suffer from not having what we envy, and we suffer from pursuing what does not actually fulfill us. The envious person is trapped in pursuing other people's dreams, other people's versions of success, other people's definitions of the good life. They have lost contact with their own authentic desires beneath the weight of comparison and competition. The emotional experience of envy is distinctive. It is not the clean pain of grief or the hot energy of anger. It is a gnawing, chronic discomfort, a background state of dissatisfaction that colors all experience. The envious person cannot fully enjoy what they have because they are focused on what others have. Their achievements feel hollow because they are measured against others' achievements and always found wanting. Nothing is ever enough because enough is defined by surpassing others, and there is always someone with more, someone achieving more, someone who appears happier or more successful or more loved. This is why envy is so corrosive to well-being. It makes contentment impossible. It transforms life into an endless competition that can never be won because the standards keep shifting, because new objects of envy constantly appear, because the fundamental problem is not external but internal, not about what we lack but about our relationship to what we have and who we are. Envy and the shadow, what we cannot admit. Carl Jung understood that envy is one of the most reliably repressed emotions because it reveals aspects of ourselves we desperately want to deny. To admit envy is to admit several unbearable truths simultaneously: that we feel inferior, that we measure ourselves against others, that we want what they have, that their success causes us pain, that we harbor hostile wishes toward people who have done us no harm. These admissions violate our self-image as good, secure, self-sufficient people, and so envy goes into the shadow, But what goes into the shadow does not disappear. It continues to operate, now unconsciously, now in disguised forms. The envious person does not say, "I envy you." They say, "You do not deserve what you have." They criticize. They find flaws. They diminish the other's achievements. Your success was luck. Your talent is overrated. Your happiness is superficial. You do not work as hard as you appear to. This criticism feels righteous to the envious person. They believe they are simply seeing clearly, speaking truth, refusing to be fooled by appearances. But beneath the criticism lives envy, and the criticism serves envy's purpose: to reduce the painful gap between self and other, to diminish what the other has so it appears less desirable, to protect the self from the full weight of the comparison. If their achievement is not really that impressive, then my lack of it is not really that shameful. If their happiness is not really that deep, then my unhappiness is not really that unbearable. This mechanism is called devaluation, and it is one of envy's primary defenses. We devalue what we envy in order to protect ourselves from the pain of wanting it. The fox in Aesop's fable who cannot reach the grapes declares them sour. This is not hypocrisy. It is psychological necessity. To continue wanting what you cannot have is unbearable. To devalue it is survival. But devaluation comes at a cost. It requires us to lie to ourselves, to distort our perception of reality, to become critics rather than creators, to focus on tearing down rather than building up. The envious person becomes imprisoned in negativity, unable to appreciate beauty or excellence or achievement in others, because appreciation would mean acknowledging what they themselves lack. Jung wrote about the problem of projection, how we project our shadow onto others and then attack them for possessing the qualities we cannot acknowledge in ourselves. But with envy, the projection is different. We do not project our envious nature onto others. We project our desired qualities. We see in others what we wish we possessed: confidence, talent, beauty, success, happiness, and then we resent them for possessing it, for being the screen onto which we project our own unlived potential. This is the tragedy of envy. It keeps us focused on others when the real work is internal. The person consumed by envy of others' achievements is not developing their own gifts. The person consumed by envy of others' relationships is not cultivating their own capacity for intimacy. The person consumed by envy of others' confidence is not doing the internal work that builds genuine self-worth. Envy is always a displacement, an externalization of an internal problem. The Jungian analyst Marie-Louise von Franz wrote that envy is often a sign that we have abandoned our own individuation process, our own journey toward becoming fully ourselves. We have lost contact with our own unique path and are instead trying to live someone else's life, to achieve someone else's version of success, to become someone else's idea of what is valuable. Envy tells us we are off course, living from the outside in rather than from the inside out. But hearing this message requires us to acknowledge the envy, to bring it into consciousness, to examine it rather than deny it. This is extraordinarily difficult because envy is bound up with shame. To say I envy you is to say I feel inferior to you. I want what you have. I am not enough as I am. These omissions feel like psychological death, like the destruction of the self-image we have carefully constructed. And yet, paradoxically, acknowledging envy is the beginning of freedom from it. When we can say, yes, I feel envy, something shifts. The emotion loses some of its power because it is no longer controlling us from the shadows. We are looking at it rather than being possessed by it. We can begin to ask, what does this envy tell me about what I truly value? What does it reveal about how I judge my own worth? What does it show me about the life I think I should be living versus the life I am actually living? These questions open a pathway towards transformation. Envy, when examined honestly, often reveals that we have internalized values that are not our own, that we are chasing achievements that do not genuinely fulfill us, that we are measuring ourselves by standards we never consciously chose. The person who envies others' wealth may discover they do not actually care deeply about money but have absorbed the belief that financial success is the measure of worth. The person who envies others' conventional lives may discover they actually crave unconventionality but fear the social consequences. Envy also reveals our sense of scarcity, our belief that there is not enough to go around, that another's success diminishes the possibility of our own, that we are in competition for limited goods, recognition, love, achievement, happiness. This scarcity mindset is often learned in childhood, in families where affection or approval were conditional and limited, where siblings competed for parental attention, where worth was distributed unequally. But this scarcity is often an illusion. Someone else's happiness does not diminish the happiness available to you. Someone else's success does not make your success less possible. Someone else's talent does not negate your gifts. The world of worth is not zero-sum, but the envious person experiences it as such, trapped in a perception where every gain elsewhere feels like a personal loss. Breaking free from this perception requires grieving. We must mourn the fantasy of being special, of being the chosen one, of being exempt from ordinary limitation and struggle. We must accept that we are one among many, that others will have gifts we lack, achievements we will not match, lives we will not live. This acceptance feels like defeat, but it is actually liberation. The mechanism of envy. How desire becomes resentment. The transformation from admiration to envy is subtle and insidious. It begins innocently enough. We see someone who has something we want, and we feel a pull toward it. This is natural. We are wired to learn from others, to be inspired by their achievements, to desire what appears valuable. But somewhere in this process, a shift occurs. The inspiration curdles into resentment. The motivation becomes contaminated with hostility. What began as I want, that becomes, why do they have that, and I do not? This shift happens when we interpret another's possession of something as evidence of our own deficiency. Their success is not just their success, it is proof of our failure. Their happiness is not just their happiness, it is indictment of our unhappiness. Their confidence is not just their confidence, it is revelation of our inadequacy. The comparison becomes personal, becomes about fundamental worth rather than about specific circumstances or choices. The mechanism at work here is what psychologists call social comparison. We constantly evaluate ourselves in relation to others, measuring our worth, our progress, our status. This is not pathological in itself. It is how we orient ourselves in the social world, how we gauge whether we are doing well or poorly, how we identify areas for growth. But healthy social comparison is informational. It tells us where we are and where we might go. Envious comparison is evaluative. It tells us we are less than, inferior, failing. Leon Festinger's social comparison theory revealed that we are most threatened by comparisons with those slightly above us, those in reach but just out of grasp. The person making slightly more money, slightly more attractive, slightly more successful. These comparisons are unbearable because they show us what we might have been, what we perhaps should have been, what we failed to become despite having similar starting points. This is why social media has intensified envy to unprecedented levels. We are constantly exposed to carefully curated highlights of others' lives. Everyone appears to be succeeding, traveling, in love, fulfilled, living their best life. And we know, intellectually, that this is performance, that we are seeing the edited version, that their struggles are hidden. But knowing this does not prevent the emotional impact. The comparison happens automatically, beneath conscious awareness, and it registers as deficit, as evidence that our life is less than, that we are not enough. The algorithm intensifies this by showing us content from people similar to us, people in our networks, people we could plausibly compare ourselves to. We are not comparing ourselves to movie stars or billionaires. We are comparing ourselves to former classmates, to colleagues, to people who started where we started. And their apparent success is unbearable precisely because we cannot dismiss it as irrelevant, cannot explain it away as different circumstances or different resources. They had what we had, and they succeeded where we failed. Envy also involves what philosophers call resentment, a French term adopted by Nietzsche to describe the psychology of the powerless. Resentment is not simple resentment. It is resentment that has fermented, that has turned inward, that has become a poisonous attitude toward life itself. The person consumed by resentment does not simply want what others have. They want others to not have it. They want to tear down rather than build up. They want to punish success rather than achieve it themselves. Nietzsche saw resentment as the psychology of slave morality, the morality of those who lack power and so make a virtue of their powerlessness. Unable to achieve what the powerful achieve, they declare those achievements worthless. Unable to live boldly, they declare boldness to be vanity. Unable to create, they become critics. This is envy's ultimate degradation, the transformation of impotence into moral superiority, the claim that not having is actually better than having, that failure is more noble than success. But this transformation is a lie, and somewhere the envious person knows it. They do not actually believe that what they envy is worthless. They want it desperately, but wanting creates pain, and so they must convince themselves they do not want it, that they are above such shallow desires, that they have higher values. This self-deception requires constant maintenance, constant vigilance against their own desires, constant reinforcement of the belief that what they cannot have is not worth having. The psychological energy consumed by this process is staggering. The envious person must monitor what others have, must find flaws in their achievements, must construct narratives that explain away their success, must maintain the fiction that they themselves are not envious but merely discerning, merely unwilling to be impressed by superficial accomplishments. This work is exhausting and endless, and it leaves little energy for actual creation, actual achievement, actual living. Envy also creates what psychologists call a hostile attribution bias. The envious person interprets others' actions as deliberately designed to hurt or humiliate them. The colleague who gets promoted is not simply being recognized for good work. They are rubbing their success in your face. The friend who shares happy news is not simply excited. They are showing off, trying to make you feel bad. The person who posts about their life is not simply documenting their experience. They are bragging, performing superiority. This hostile attribution is not conscious malice. It is automatic, a lens through which all social information is filtered, and it creates a vicious cycle. The envious person becomes defensive, withdrawn, hostile. Others notice this and pull away. The envious person then has further confirmation that the world is against them, that others succeed while they are excluded, that their suspicions were correct. The isolation intensifies the envy, and the envy intensifies the isolation. The mechanism of envy is therefore self-perpetuating. It creates the conditions that reinforce it. The more envious we become, the less able we are to form genuine connections, to celebrate others, to collaborate, to receive help or recognition. We become trapped in a prison of our own making, always watching others through the bars, always suffering from their apparent freedom, never recognizing that the key to our cell is in our own hand. Envy and identity, the existential wound. The existentialists understood that envy is fundamentally a crisis of identity, a failure to accept oneself as one is, a refusal to inhabit one's own existence. Kierkegaard wrote about the despair of not willing to be oneself, and envy is perhaps the clearest manifestation of this despair. The envious person is in flight from their own being. constantly wishing to be someone else, to have someone else's life, to possess someone else's qualities. This flight is existentially catastrophic because it means we are never present in our own lives. We are always elsewhere in imagination, living vicariously through those we envy, fantasizing about the life we would have if only we possessed what they possess. We become tourists in our own existence, passing through without truly inhabiting it, always looking over the fence at what appears to be a better garden. Sartre understood that we are condemned to be free, condemned to create ourselves through our choices. But the envious person refuses this freedom. They claim that if only they had different circumstances, different gifts, different luck, then they could become who they truly are. But this is bad faith, the denial of the fundamental existential truth that we are nothing other than what we make of ourselves through our choices, through our actions, through how we respond to our circumstances. The person who envies another's talent is refusing to develop their own gifts. The person who envies another's courage is refusing to act courageously with whatever fear they carry. The person who envies another's freedom is refusing to take the risks that create freedom. Envy is always a displacement of responsibility, a way of making our identity dependent on external factors rather than on our own choices. Heidegger spoke of authenticity as taking up one's almost possibility, becoming what one uniquely can become rather than conforming to the anonymous they. But envy is the opposite of authenticity. It is conformity to others' standards, to others' versions of success, to others' definitions of the good life. The envious person has lost contact with their own almost possibility because they are too busy measuring themselves against others' actualization. This loss of authenticity creates a peculiar kind of suffering. It is not simply the pain of not having what we want. It is the deeper pain of not knowing what we want, of having lost contact with our own desires beneath the weight of comparison. The envious person cannot answer the question, what do I truly want? Because all they're wanting is mediated through others. They want what others have, what others value, what others achieve. They have become a mirror reflecting others' lives rather than a source generating their own. The existential wound of envy is therefore the wound of inauthenticity, of living at a distance from oneself, of being estranged from one's own existence. The envious person is homeless in the most fundamental sense. They do not inhabit their own life. They are always elsewhere, in fantasy, in comparison, in the imagined life they would have if only they were someone else. This homelessness creates a specific kind of temporal distortion. Healthy human existence involves being present in the now while oriented toward a future we are creating through our choices. But the envious person is stuck in a perpetual present that is always lacking, always deficient when measured against others. Their future is not something they are creating, but something they are waiting for, the moment when they will finally have what others have, when they will finally be enough. But this future never arrives because the standards keep changing, because new objects of envy constantly appear, because the fundamental problem is not external but internal. The issue is not what they lack but their relationship to what they have, not what they are not but their inability to accept what they are. Camus wrote about the absurd, the confrontation between human need for meaning and the universe's indifference to that need. But envy introduces a different absurdity. It is the absurdity of suffering over invented deficiencies, of creating hierarchies of worth and then suffering from our position within them, of turning existence into a competition, and then experiencing our lives as perpetual failure. The person who envies another's beauty has created beauty as a measure of worth, and then judges themselves by that measure. But beauty as worth is not a natural law. It is a constructed value, arbitrary and cultural. The same is true for wealth, for status, for achievement, for any object of envy. We create the standards by which we judge ourselves insufficient, and then we suffer from that insufficiency as if it were an objective fact, rather than a chosen framework. This is the existential absurdity of envy. We are authors of our own suffering, creating the very judgments that torment us, constructing the hierarchies that place us at the bottom, defining worth in ways that guarantee we will feel worthless. And then we experience this as fate, as unchangeable reality, as evidence of our fundamental deficiency. Breaking free from this absurdity requires what Sartre called radical freedom, the recognition that we are not determined by our circumstances, by others' judgments, by the values we have internalized. We can choose differently. We can define worth differently. We can measure our lives by different standards. We can stop comparing altogether and simply live, simply be, simply inhabit our existence without constant reference to how it measures up to others' existence. But this freedom is terrifying. It means taking full responsibility for our lives, for our choices, for our identity. It means we can no longer blame circumstances, can no longer point to what others have as explanation for what we lack. It means facing the void, the absence of external validation or guarantee, the necessity of creating our own meaning without knowing whether we are succeeding. Envy protects us from this freedom. It provides excuses, explanations, externalized responsibility. If only I had what they have, then I could be who I am meant to be. This formula is comforting because it places the problem outside ourselves, makes our identity dependent on external factors we do not control. But it is also a prison, a way of guaranteeing we will never be free, never be authentic, never fully inhabit our own existence. Part 6. 1000 Words. The Neuroscience of Envy. Modern neuroscience has begun to map the neural architecture of envy, and what we discover confirms what philosophers and psychologists have long understood. Envy is not simply a moral failing or a character weakness. It is a specific pattern of brain activity with identifiable neural signatures that help explain why this emotion is so powerful, so resistant to rational intervention, so deeply woven into human psychology. Brain imaging studies reveal that envy activates two distinct neural systems, often simultaneously. The first is the pain network, the same circuits that process physical pain. When we experience envy, particularly intense envy, the anterior cingulate cortex lights up with activity. This is the region that registers the distress of social pain, of rejection, of exclusion. The brain processes envy as it processes being hurt, as injury, as damage to the self. This is not metaphorical. The suffering of envy is registered in the same neural pathways that register physical injury. When we say envy hurts, we are describing a neurological reality. The envious person is in pain, genuine measurable pain that shows up on brain scans, pain that activates stress responses throughout the body. But envy also activates a second system, one more disturbing. When people witness the misfortune of those they envy, when the envied person loses what they had or suffers setback, a different region activates, the ventral striatum, part of the brain's reward circuitry. This is the region that processes pleasure, satisfaction, the anticipation of reward. In other words, the suffering of those we envy activates our pleasure centers. The Germans have a word for this, Schadenfreude, pleasure in another's misfortune. Neuroscience reveals that this is not some rare pathology. It is a predictable neural response to the suffering of those who have triggered our envy. The brain that experiences pain at their success experiences pleasure at their failure. This is the dark psychology of envy made visible in neural activity, the secret wish that we are ashamed to acknowledge, but that our brains enact automatically. Research by Hidehiko Takahashi and colleagues in Japan measured this pattern precisely. Participants read about fictional characters, some of whom were described in ways designed to trigger envy, possessing desirable qualities and achievements. When participants read about these envied characters experiencing misfortune, their ventral striatum showed increased activation. The degree of activation correlated with how much envy they had reported feeling. The more envy, the more pleasure in the envied person's suffering. This helps explain why envy is so socially destructive. It creates a perverse incentive structure where other people's failures make us feel better, where we are secretly, unconsciously invested in others not succeeding. This is why envious people often sabotage others, spread gossip, undermine achievements. They are not consciously malicious. They are seeking the neurochemical reward that comes from reducing the painful gap between themselves and the envied other. The prefrontal cortex, the region associated with rational thought and self-regulation, shows reduced activity during episodes of intense envy. This explains why envy is so resistant to rational intervention. When in the grip of envy, we literally have less access to the brain regions that could provide perspective, that could regulate the emotional response, that could choose a different interpretation of the situation. The emotion hijacks cognition, making it feel like objective reality rather than subjective reaction. Neuroscience has also revealed the role of social comparison circuits in envy. The medial prefrontal cortex, involved in thinking about ourselves in relation to others, shows hyperactivity in chronically envious individuals. They are constantly engaged in social comparison, constantly evaluating where they stand relative to others, constantly monitoring the social hierarchy. This hyperactivity is exhausting and creates chronic stress, but it happens automatically, beneath conscious awareness. The brain's mirror neuron system also plays a role. Mirror neurons allow us to simulate others' experiences, to feel what they feel, to understand their mental states. But in envy, this system creates a cruel irony. We can vividly imagine the pleasure the envied person feels from their success, which intensifies our pain. We simulate their joy, but instead of creating empathy, it creates resentment. We feel what they feel, and it makes us suffer. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter associated with reward and motivation, shows dysregulation in envious states. Normally, dopamine motivates us toward goals by creating anticipation of reward. But in envy, dopamine becomes attached not to our own potential achievements, but to fantasies of the envied person losing what they have. We become motivated not toward building our own success, but toward scenarios where others fail. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which regulates stress responses, shows chronic activation in people prone to envy. They live in a constant state of physiological stress, cortisol levels elevated, immune function suppressed, cardiovascular system strained. Envy is not just psychologically toxic, it is physiologically damaging, contributing to inflammation, hypertension, and numerous stress-related illnesses. Research on the default mode network, active when we are at rest and engaged in self-referential thinking, shows that envious individuals spend more time thinking about social comparisons, about how they measure up to others, about hierarchies of worth and status. Even when not consciously comparing themselves to others, their brains are running comparison algorithms in the background, generating a constant stream of evaluative judgments about relative worth. Neuroscience has also revealed that envy can become habitual through repeated activation of the same neural pathways. Each time we engage in envious comparison, we strengthen the circuits that support that comparison. Over time, envious thinking becomes automatic, the default mode of processing social information. The brain becomes wired for envy, making it progressively harder to see others' success without experiencing pain. But neuroscience also offers hope. The brain retains plasticity, the ability to change. When we interrupt envious patterns, when we practice different ways of responding to others' success, when we cultivate appreciation rather than resentment, new neural pathways form. The pain response to others' success can weaken. The reward response to others' suffering can diminish. The hyperactive comparison circuits can calm. This rewiring is not quick or easy. It requires consistent practice over time, often supported by therapy or mindfulness training. But it is possible. The envious brain is not fixed. It is a pattern that developed through experience and can be reshaped through different experience. Beyond envy, transformation, and self-acceptance. If envy is so deeply wired into our neurobiology, if it serves psychological functions, if it is activated by the very social comparisons that are inevitable in human life, then what hope exists for freedom from it? This is the question that haunts anyone who has felt envy's corrosive grip, who has watched it poison their relationships, their achievements, their capacity for joy. The answer is not simple, but it begins with a paradox. We must face what we are most ashamed to acknowledge. The first step toward liberation from envy is admitting that we feel it, not to others necessarily, but to ourselves. This admission is extraordinarily difficult because envy is bound up with shame, with the feeling that experiencing envy reveals us as petty, insecure, fundamentally inadequate. But hiding envy only strengthens it. What remains in shadow grows more powerful. What is brought into consciousness can be examined, understood, transformed. When we can say to ourselves, yes, I feel envy toward this person, something shifts. The emotion loses some of its grip because we are no longer identified with it. We are observing it rather than being possessed by it. There is now space between the self and the emotion, and in that space, choice becomes possible. We can ask, what does this envy tell me? What need underlies it? What value does it reveal? What wound does it touch? These questions transform envy from enemy into teacher. Envy shows us what we care about, even if what we care about is something we have not consciously chosen. It reveals the internalized values we are measuring ourselves against. It points to the wounds where we feel most inadequate, most vulnerable, most in need of healing. When we examine envy rather than simply suffering from it, it becomes information rather than condemnation. Jung's concept of integration is crucial here. We cannot eliminate envy by fighting it, by condemning ourselves for feeling it, by trying to become someone who never experiences such base emotions. That approach only drives envy deeper into the shadow where it operates more powerfully. Instead, we must integrate it, acknowledge it as part of the full spectrum of human experience, understand its origins and its functions. This integration requires self-compassion, which is different from self-esteem. Self-esteem is conditional, based on measuring ourselves favorably against others or against standards. But self-compassion is unconditional, based on recognizing that we are human, that all humans struggle, that suffering and inadequacy are part of the shared human condition. When we can hold our envy with compassion rather than shame, when we can say, this is hard, this is painful, everyone feels this sometimes, the envy loses its power to define us. Transformation also requires shifting from comparative to intrinsic measures of worth. As long as we measure ourselves against others, envy is inevitable, because there will always be someone with more, someone achieving more, someone who appears happier or more successful. But when we measure ourselves against our own values, our own growth, our own sense of purpose, comparison becomes less relevant. The question shifts from am I better than others to am I becoming who I want to become? This is not easy. We are social creatures, wired for comparison, surrounded by cultures that constantly rank and evaluate and measure worth in relative terms. But it is possible to develop what psychologists call an internal locus of evaluation, a sense of worth that comes from within rather than from external validation or comparison. This requires knowing what we value, what we genuinely care about independent of what others value, what brings us authentic satisfaction rather than what we think should satisfy us. The practice of gratitude is often prescribed for envy, but it must be genuine, not performative. Forcing ourselves to list things we are grateful for while still seething with envy toward others does not work. But genuinely shifting attention from what we lack to what we have, from others' lives to our own, from comparison to appreciation, this can gradually rewire the neural pathways that support envious thinking. Mindfulness practice offers tools for this work. When we notice envious thoughts arising, we can observe them without immediately believing them or acting on them. The thought, they have what I should have, appears, but instead of being consumed by it, we can note, envious thought arising. This creates distance, creates choice, creates the possibility of responding differently than we have habitually responded. We must also grieve. Envy often involves grief for the life we are not living, the person we are not, the achievements we have not accomplished. But this grief is often denied, covered over with resentment toward those who appear to have what we lost or never had. Allowing ourselves to mourn, to feel the sadness beneath the envy, to acknowledge what we truly wanted and did not get, this is essential. Grief, when allowed, moves through us and releases. Envy, when held onto, becomes chronic. There is also the practice of genuine celebration of others, of training ourselves to feel joy at others' success rather than pain. This sounds impossible when in the grip of envy, but it is trainable. Each time we notice envy arising and consciously choose a different response, that's wonderful for them. They worked hard for that. I'm happy, they're happy. We weaken the envious neural pathway and strengthen an alternative one. This does not mean denying our own desires or pretending we do not want what we want. It means uncoupling others' gain from our loss, recognizing that their success does not diminish us, that there is not a finite amount of worth or happiness or achievement to go around. This abundance mindset is difficult to cultivate in a culture of scarcity, but it is essential for freedom from envy. We must also act, must develop our own gifts, pursue our own goals, create our own version of a good life rather than envying others' versions. Envy thrives in passivity, in the gap between who we are and who we could be. When we are actively engaged in our own becoming, when we are creating rather than comparing, envy has less space to operate. We are too busy living our own lives to obsessively monitor others' lives. Conclusion: the psychology of envy reveals one of the most painful aspects of human existence. Our tendency to measure our worth through comparison, to experience others' success as our failure, to want what we do not have more than we appreciate what we do. Envy is the emotion of the wounded self, desperately seeking validation, perpetually finding evidence of inadequacy. But envy is also deeply human, nearly universal, wired into our social brains through millions of years of evolution. We are not bad for feeling it. We are human. The shame we feel about envy often causes more suffering than the envy itself. We compound the pain of feeling inadequate with the shame of being someone who feels envious, creating a double wound. Understanding envy does not eliminate it, but it changes our relationship to it. We can see it as information rather than identity, as a signal pointing to unmet needs rather than evidence of fundamental deficiency. We can examine what we envy and ask whether we genuinely want those things or whether we want them because we believe we should, because our culture values them, because we think they would prove our worth. Often, what we discover is that the objects of envy are not what we truly desire. We envy what we have been taught to value, not what genuinely fulfills us. The liberation from envy sometimes comes not from getting what we envy, but from questioning whether we actually want it, from reconnecting with our authentic desires beneath the weight of comparison and cultural conditioning. Envy thrives in isolation, in the belief that we alone feel this way, that our inadequacy is unique, that everyone else has achieved what we have failed to achieve. But this is an illusion. Everyone feels envy. Everyone struggles with comparison. Everyone has areas where they feel insufficient. The difference is not in the feeling, but in how we relate to it, whether we let it consume us, or whether we use it as information about what we care about and where we need to grow. The transformation from envy to appreciation, from comparison to authentic engagement with our own lives, is gradual and incomplete. There will be moments when envy resurfaces, when we feel that familiar gnawing pain at another's success. This is not failure. This is being human. The work is not to eliminate envy, but to no longer be controlled by it, to feel it without believing it, to observe it without acting on it. Jung taught that what we resist persists, that the shadow grows more powerful when denied. Envy, when brought into consciousness, when acknowledged with compassion, when examined with curiosity, loses much of its destructive power. It becomes one emotion among many, a passing state rather than a permanent condition, information rather than identity. The path beyond envy is the path toward authenticity, toward living from the inside out rather than from the outside in, toward measuring our lives by our own values rather than by comparison with others. It is the path toward self-acceptance, not a conditional acceptance of achieving what we think will make us worthy, but the unconditional acceptance of being human, being limited, being one among many. This path requires courage, requires us to face the wounds that envy protects us from feeling, the shame that comparison both creates and conceals, the grief of accepting that we cannot have everything, cannot be everyone, cannot live all possible lives. But it also offers something precious, the possibility of genuine presence in our own existence, the capacity to celebrate others without diminishing ourselves, the freedom to pursue what we authentically desire rather than what we think we should desire. We are not our envy. We never were. We are the consciousness that can witness envy, that can understand its origins, that can choose how to respond to it. And in that consciousness, in that capacity for choice, lies our freedom. If this exploration of envy has helped you see your own struggles with comparison in a new light, if you recognize patterns you have lived but perhaps not named, know that this recognition is the beginning of transformation. Envy thrives in secrecy and shame. By examining it honestly, you have already begun to loosen its grip. Subscribe to this channel if you seek content that explores the difficult emotions and hidden dynamics of human psychology with depth and compassion, that does not offer quick fixes but invites genuine understanding. Share this with someone who might be struggling with envy, who needs to know they are not uniquely flawed, that liberation is possible. Leave a comment sharing your reflections on envy, on comparison, on the journey towards self-acceptance. This community exists for those willing to examine the shadow aspects of human nature without judgment, to bring consciousness to what operates in darkness, to do the difficult work of transformation. We all struggle with envy. The question is whether we will face it honestly or let it operate from the shadows, poisoning our relationships and our capacity for joy. Remember, someone else's success is not your failure. Someone else's happiness does not diminish the happiness available to you. You are not in competition with everyone else for a limited supply of worth. You are on your own path, living your own life, becoming your own version of what it means to be human, and that is enough.